The shriek cut through the peaceful Saturday morning like a chainsaw through butter. "What do you think you're doing?" Michael Reeves froze, garden shears in hand, half-turned toward the sound that had just shattered his weekend zen. There, standing at the edge of his freshly mulched floor with her hands planted firmly on her hips, stood a woman he'd never seen before. Her platinum blonde bob was cut with such precision it could probably slice the very air around it, and her white capri pants seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. "Excuse me," Michael managed, still holding a branch of his rose bush mid-snip. "Those roses are completely against AHOA regulations. I've already called the police." The woman thrust a finger toward his prized heritage roses, the ones his grandmother had cultivated for decades before passing them down to him. Michael blinked slowly, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but Karen Westfield. I'm the new president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She said the title as if announcing herself as supreme ruler of the known universe. "And you are in flagrant violation of Bylaw 7, Section C, Paragraph 4. No vegetation may exceed 48 inches in height within 10 feet of property lines." The problem, as Michael was about to explain, was that they weren't standing in Oak Ridge Estates. His home was in Meadowbrook Commons, the neighboring development. There was no shared HOA. But Karen didn't give him the chance. "I've documented everything," she continued, waving her phone camera toward his roses. "The police are on their way. You'll be removing these immediately or facing fines starting at $100 per day." Michael set down his shears and pulled off his gardening gloves. "Ms. Westfield." "That's Mrs. Westfield," she corrected with a sniff. "Mrs. Westfield, there seems to be a misunderstanding." "This isn't." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. A police cruiser had pulled up and a weary-looking officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Someone called about a property dispute." Officer Jenkins had been on the force for 15 years. He recognized a Karen situation when he saw one. "Officer, thank goodness you're here." Karen rushed toward him. "This man is in violation of multiple HOA regulations, and when I attempted to address it with him, he became hostile and threatening." Michael's jaw dropped. "I did no such thing." Karen turned to the officer, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "He had garden shears, officer. He was brandishing them when I approached." Officer Jenkins glanced at the pruning shears innocently resting on the garden bench. He sighed almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, let's start with the property lines. You're saying this gentleman's roses violate your HOA rules?" "Absolutely," Karen said with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every petty rule in a 2-inch binder. "And as AHOA president, I demand you enforce his compliance. Arrest him if necessary." Michael stepped forward. "Officer, I'd like to show you something." He reached slowly for his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. From it, he extracted a property deed. Karen smiled triumphantly as Officer Jenkins reviewed the document. Her smile began to fade, however, when the officer looked up with an expression she hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you aware that this property is not part of Oak Ridge Estates?" Karen's face cycled through expressions like a slot machine. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, stubborn refusal to accept reality. "That's impossible." She snatched the property deed from Officer Jenkins' hands, scanning it with narrowed eyes. "This entire street is Oak Ridge. I have the maps right here." She fumbled with her phone, pulling up a PDF of what looked like a developer's original plans. "These were the proposed boundaries," Michael explained patiently. "But if you check the actual county records, you will see that my property and the 6 others on this cul-de-sac were ultimately developed as part of Meadowbrook Commons. We have a different AOA, which, by the way, I'm not a member of either." Karen's nostrils flared. "These plans clearly show." "Ma'am," Officer Jenkins interjected, "the legal property records take precedence over developer proposals. If Mr. Reeves' deed says he's in Meadowbrook Commons, then he's in Meadowbrook Commons." Rather than accepting defeat, Karen switched tactics with alarming agility. "Fine, but he's still in violation of city ordinances about vegetation height. Section 12 to 47 clearly states. That ordinance applies to visibility at traffic intersections," Officer Jenkins said, his patience visibly thinning. "This is a private residence in the middle of a cul-de-sac." Michael couldn't help but be impressed by the officer's knowledge. Jenkins noticed his look and shrugged. "I get a lot of these calls." Karen wasn't done. Her eyes darted around Michael's property like a predator seeking weakness. "What about those?" She pointed accusingly at the wind chimes hanging from a branch of the oak tree near his porch. "Noise ordinances prohibit. They're within the acceptable decibel range," Michael said. "I checked before installing them." "And that shed?" Karen pivoted, pointing to the small structure behind his garden. "Properly permitted 2 years ago," Michael replied, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction at being so thoroughly prepared for an inspection he never expected. Karen's face was turning an alarming shade of red. Officer Jenkins, recognizing the signs of an impending explosion, stepped between them. Mrs. Westfield, it seems there's been a misunderstanding about jurisdiction. Mr. Reeves' property is not under your HOA's authority. I know my rights, Karen declared, her voice rising to a pitch that caused birds to flee from nearby trees. I'm a taxpayer. My husband plays golf with the mayor. Michael exchanged a look with Officer Jenkins, who seemed to be fighting the urge to roll his eyes. Perhaps, Michael suggested gently, we could discuss this like reasonable adults. This was apparently the wrong thing to say. Karen's eyes widened as if he'd suggested something obscene. Reasonable, reasonable. I have spent weeks organizing the HOA files, creating spreadsheets of violations, and establishing a new system of fines. I will not have my authority undermined by botanical rebels. The term botanical rebel nearly caused Michael to burst out laughing, but he maintained his composure. Barely. Mrs. Westfield, Officer Jenkins said firmly, you are now trespassing on Mr. Reeves' private property. I must ask you to leave. The word trespassing hit Karen like a bucket of cold water. Trespassing? Me? I'm here in an official capacity as someone with no jurisdiction, Jenkins finished for her. Now you can leave voluntarily or we can discuss obstruction charges. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, resembling a particularly indignant goldfish. Finally, she straightened her designer jacket, lifted her chin, and delivered her parting shot. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. She turned on her heel, marching back toward Oak Ridge Estates with the rigid posture of someone who'd been deeply wronged by the universe itself. As they watched her retreat, Officer Jenkins turned to Michael with a weary expression. Word of advice, security cameras. I have a feeling she'll be back. Michael nodded, watching Karen's receding figure. Think she'll let it go? Jenkins chuckled. In 15 years on the force, I've never seen a Karen just let it go. Neither of them knew just how prophetic those words would prove to be. By Wednesday afternoon, Karen Westfield had evolved from nuisance to nemesis. The past 3 days had seen a campaign of escalating hostilities that left Michael wondering if he'd somehow offended a deity in a past life. It began with Karen parking herself in a lawn chair at the edge of his property line, clipboard in hand, documenting every movement on his property with the diligence of a wildlife photographer stalking a rare species. When Michael approached, she loudly recited ordinance numbers into her phone's voice recorder. Next came the flyers. Every mailbox in both neighborhoods received an urgent notice about community standards under threat, with a poorly photoshopped image of Michael's roses, edited to look like a menacing tangle of thorns threatening to devour a child's bicycle. This is getting ridiculous, Michael muttered to himself as he crumpled the third flyer that had somehow found its way onto his windshield. Following Officer Jenkins' advice, he'd installed security cameras the day after their initial encounter. The footage from the previous night showed Karen slipping the flyer under his wiper at 11:47 p.m., looking both ways with the exaggerated caution of a cartoon burglar. Today's escalation involved 5 different county vehicles parked outside his home. Karen had apparently spent her morning calling every regulatory department in existence: building inspection, code enforcement, health department, animal control, despite Michael not owning any pets, and even water conservation. Michael stood on his porch watching as baffled county employees wandered his property, occasionally exchanging confused glances with each other. Sir, do you know why we were called about an alligator on the premises? Asked the animal control officer, a young woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. An alligator, Michael echoed incredulously. From her strategic position across the street, Karen cupped her hands around her mouth. Check the garden pond. It could be hiding. The garden pond was a small bird bath. The building inspector approached next, flipping through his forms. We received a report about an unauthorized second-story addition. Michael lived in a ranch-style home. There was no second story. By late afternoon, all the inspectors had left, having found nothing of concern beyond a loose gutter nail that the building inspector helpfully tightened for free. As the last county vehicle pulled away, Michael noticed Karen on her phone gesticulating wildly. Even from a distance, her frustration was palpable. His neighbor, Eleanor, an 80-year-old retired judge with a penchant for gardening and no tolerance for nonsense, ambled over from her adjacent property. That woman tried to get me to sign a petition to have your roses classified as an invasive species, Eleanor informed him, leaning on her cane. I told her the only invasive species I was concerned about was her. Michael chuckled. Thanks for having my back, Eleanor. She doesn't know who she's dealing with, Eleanor said, eyes twinkling mischievously. You know, when I was on the bench, I saw all kinds of characters. The ones like her, they're running from something. Nobody gets that worked up over rose bushes unless there's something else eating at them. Michael watched as Karen, having finished her call, marched toward her gleaming white SUV with lively laugh love decals on the rear window. What do you think is next? He asked. Eleanor shrugged. Hard to say, but she's not the type to admit defeat. People like that either escalate until they self-destruct or they find a new target. Great, Michael sighed. So I either wait for nuclear meltdown or hope she finds someone else to harass. Or, Eleanor said thoughtfully, you could try something completely unexpected. Like what? Surrender my roses to her landscaping dictatorship? Eleanor's smile turned enigmatic. No, dear, something much more interesting than that. As they spoke, Karen's SUV pulled away from the curb with a squeal of tires. But instead of leaving the neighborhood, she merely circled the block, returning to park directly across from Michael's house once more. Through the windshield, they could see her furiously typing on her laptop. I think, Eleanor observed, she's settling in for the long haul. So am I, Michael replied, finding an unexpected resolve hardening within him. These roses have been in my family for 3 generations. They survived 2 transplants, a blight in the 90s, and a hailstorm that destroyed everything else in my grandmother's garden. They're not going anywhere because some self-appointed suburban dictator doesn't like their aesthetic. Eleanor patted his arm approvingly. That's the spirit. Now I believe I'll go make us some iced tea. Something tells me we're going to need refreshments for whatever show she's planning next. As if on cue, Karen emerged from her vehicle with a staple gun and a stack of laminated signs. Karen Westfield had not achieved her position as Hillwood president through half measures. By Friday morning, she had assembled what she grandly termed the Neighborhood Preservation Committee, consisting of 5 like-minded individuals who shared her passion for conformity and her disdain for botanical individualism. They gathered in Karen's immaculate living room where a PowerPoint presentation titled Operation Rose Removal glowed on a large TV screen. The attendees sipped coffee from matching mugs emblazoned with HOA Enforcement Squad, rush-ordered merchandise that Karen considered a worthwhile investment in team morale. As you can see from these surveillance photos, Karen said, clicking to a slide showing Michael watering his roses, the subject remains defiant. Despite clear documentation of violations, county officials have failed to take appropriate action. Diane, a retired accountant with a permanent expression of smelling something unpleasant, raised her hand. Didn't we establish that his property isn't actually in our HOA? Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. A technicality. The roses are visible from Oak Ridge Estate's streets, creating an aesthetic disturbance that impacts our property values. But can we actually do anything about property outside our jurisdiction? Asked Walter, a newcomer to the committee who had primarily joined for the promised refreshments. That's precisely why we need a coordinated approach, Karen replied smoothly. Individually, our hands might be tied. Collectively, we can create enough pressure to force compliance. She switched to the next slide, featuring a complex flowchart with multiple decision paths, all somehow leading to the same conclusion: roses removed. I've divided our strategy into phases, she explained. Phase 1, documentation and reporting. Phase 2, public awareness campaign. Phase 3, legal action. Phase 4, community intervention. The committee members exchanged uncertain glances at the mention of legal action and community intervention, but Karen forged ahead, distributing folders containing schedules, checklists, and liability waivers. Walter and Diane, you'll handle the petition drive. Marilyn, I need you to research municipal codes. Find me something, anything we can use. Roger, you'll coordinate with the media. I've already contacted Channel 7 about a potential story on neighborhood disputes. The actual news? Roger looked startled. Don't you think that's a bit much for some roses? It's not about the roses, Karen said, her voice taking on a zealous quality that made several committee members shift uncomfortably in their seats. It's about precedent. Today, it's oversized rose bushes. Tomorrow, it could be unauthorized wind chimes or non-regulation mailboxes. Where does it end? The rhetorical question hung in the air as Karen moved to the window, dramatically pulling back the curtain to reveal a view of the street. Our neighborhood stands at a crossroads. Either we maintain the standards that make Oak Ridge Estates the premier community in this county, or we surrender to chaos. In the driveway across the street, a man unloaded groceries from his car, completely unaware he had just been cast as the harbinger of suburban apocalypse. After the meeting, as committee members filed out clutching their assignment folders, Karen's husband Dave lingered in the doorway of his home office, where he'd been hiding during the gathering. Don't you think you're taking this a bit far, honey? He ventured carefully. It's just some flowers. Karen's head snapped toward him with such speed that Dave instinctively took a step back. Just flowers? She repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, like the Hendersons' unapproved mailbox was just a mailbox, like the Paddles' unauthorized bird feeder was just a bird feeder. Dave recognized the signs of an impending tirade and tried to retreat, but Karen followed him into his office. Before I became president, this HOA was a laughingstock. Fence heights varied by up to 2 inches between properties. People were using non-approved paint colors on their garden sheds. One family had 7 different types of shrubs in a single front yard. I remember, dear, Dave said soothingly, eyes darting toward his computer as if it might offer escape. I promise change, Dave. I promise uniformity and order. The members elected me to enforce the standards, and that's exactly what I intend to do, whether that rebel gardener is technically in our HOA or not. As Karen marched out, Dave sighed and opened his email, finding yet another message from a neighbor complaining about his wife's latest crusade. He deleted it without reading, adding it to the dozens he'd been quietly disposing of all week. Meanwhile, across the neighborhood boundary, Michael was about to discover just how creative Karen's community intervention phase could be. The weekend brought an uneasy quiet to Michael's property. Too quiet. After days of constant Karen surveillance, the sudden absence of her white SUV felt less like relief and more like the calm before a storm. His security cameras showed no sign of midnight flyer distribution or early morning ordnance recitations. By Sunday afternoon, the silence had become so unsettling that Michael found himself checking his cameras every hour, certain he was missing something. He was right. At 3:17 p.m., camera number 2 captured movement at the far corner of his property, a figure in beige slacks and a navy polo shirt, half concealed behind the large oak tree. The man was speaking into what appeared to be a walkie-talkie, while making notes on a clipboard. Michael rewound the footage and watched the stranger methodically photograph his property line markers, jotting down coordinates with military precision. When the man finished, he gave a thumbs up toward the street and vanished around the corner. Switching to camera number 3, Michael caught sight of a Henderson's land surveying van parked 2 houses down. A logo on its side featured a cartoon surveyor with the slogan, "Measuring success one boundary at a time." "What are you up to now, Karen?" Michael muttered, grabbing his phone to call Officer Jenkins. Before he could dial, another alert pinged. Camera number 1 had detected motion at his front walkway. The screen showed a delivery person, at least someone dressed like a delivery person, placing an oversized envelope against his door before hurrying away without ringing the bell. Michael cautiously retrieved the envelope, which was unmarked except for his address printed in blocky letters. Inside was a thick document titled Notice of Intent to File Civil Action, followed by dozens of pages of legal jargon. The complaint alleged that his rose bushes extended 3 inches over a property line, constituting intentional encroachment and aesthetic nuisance. The plaintiff was listed as Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, with Karen Westfield's signature prominently displayed on the final page. Michael's phone rang. It was Eleanor. "Are you seeing this circus?" she asked without preamble. "The surveyor or the fake lawsuit?" "Both, plus the drone." "What drone?" "There's a drone hovering over your backyard right now. One of those fancy ones with a camera." Michael rushed to his back window. Sure enough, a white quadcopter hovered about 30 feet above his garden, its camera clearly pointed at his roses. "This is getting out of hand," Michael said, watching the drone execute a perfect grid pattern over his property. "I'm calling Jenkins." "Already did," Eleanor replied. "He's on his way. By the way, did you know they're holding a neighborhood meeting about you tonight? 7 o'clock at the Oak Ridge Community Center. The flyer says emergency session to address threat to community standards." Michael groaned. "Am I allowed to attend my own public shaming?" "Technically, no. It's for HOA members only. But I've got a plan." Eleanor explained that her grandson, a college student majoring in film production, had offered to attend with his camera equipment under the guise of documenting HOA proceedings for a class project on community governance. "Karen will love the attention," Eleanor chuckled. "She has no idea he'll be feeding us live footage." By the time Officer Jenkins arrived, the surveyor and drone had disappeared, but the officer still documented the suspicious delivery and advised Michael to preserve all evidence. "She's building towards something," Jenkins warned. "In my experience, when they go quiet and start gathering evidence, they're planning a big move." "What could she possibly do next?" Michael wondered. "She's already tried official channels, public pressure, and now fake legal threats." Jenkins' expression turned grave. "There's a pattern I've seen before. When people like Mrs. Westfield feel their authority is being challenged, they sometimes take matters into their own hands." "You think she damaged my property?" Michael asked, alarmed at the thought. "Not directly," Jenkins clarified. "People like her prefer to maintain plausible deniability, but she might encourage others to act on her behalf." As if to underscore his point, camera number 4 pinged an alert. 3 teenagers were walking slowly past Michael's property, pointing at his roses and checking something on their phones. One of them took a picture before they moved on. Jenkins watched the footage with concern. "Do you have somewhere else you could stay tonight?" "I'm not leaving my home because of neighborhood rosebush politics," Michael said firmly. "Then at least consider additional security. Motion-activated lights, maybe a visible camera at the front entrance." Michael nodded, but a plan was already forming in his mind. one that didn't involve retreat or fortification. If Karen wanted a showdown, perhaps it was time to give her one, just not the kind she was expecting. As Jenkins left, Michael called Eleanor back. About that live feed from the meeting tonight, I have an idea that might just change the game entirely. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center buzzed with anticipation. Attendance at HOA meetings typically hovered around 12 residents, most of whom came solely for the complimentary cookies. Tonight, however, over 50 people packed the room, drawn by Karen's provocative flyers promising decisive action against community threats. Karen stood at the podium, resplendent in a red blazer with gold buttons that gave her the air of a general addressing troops before battle. Behind her, a projection screen displayed a dramatically enhanced photo of Michael's roses, with red circles highlighting areas Karen deemed particularly offensive. "Order, please." Karen rapped her gavel, silencing the chatter. "This emergency session of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA will now come to order." In the back row, Eleanor's grandson Ethan set up his camera equipment with professional efficiency. Karen beamed at him. "We're being documented for educational purposes," she announced proudly. "A university study on effective HOA governance." Ethan gave a thumbs up, hiding his smile. Little did Karen know that his equipment was live-streaming directly to Michael's living room, where Michael sat with Eleanor and Officer Jenkins, watching the proceedings unfold. "For those who haven't been following the situation," Karen began, "we face an unprecedented challenge to our community standards." She clicked to the next slide, showing a neighborhood map with Michael's property highlighted in alarming red. "This row homeowner has refused to comply with reasonable aesthetic guidelines, maintaining overgrown vegetation that threatens our property values and community harmony." The murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked confused. "Didn't you say this house isn't actually in our HOA?" asked a woman in the front row. Karen's smile didn't waver. "Technically correct, Brenda. However, as the adjacent HOA with superior property values, we have a vested interest in maintaining standards across neighborhood boundaries." "Is that legal?" someone else ventured. "That brings me to tonight's agenda," Karen continued smoothly, ignoring the question. "Our legal committee has prepared a multi-pronged approach to address this situation." She introduced Roger, a retired insurance adjuster who'd been drafted into service as the legal committee despite having no legal background whatsoever. Roger nervously approached the podium, clutching papers that trembled visibly in his hands. "We've identified several potential courses of action," he began hesitantly. "First, a class action lawsuit alleging diminished property values due to visual blight." Back in Michael's living room, Officer Jenkins shook his head. None of this would hold up in court for 10 seconds. "She knows that," Eleanor said, eyes fixed on the screen. "This isn't about winning a legal battle. It's about wearing him down." On screen, Karen had reclaimed the podium and was now revealing what she called Phase 4, community intervention. "Since traditional channels have failed us, we must take more direct action," she declared. "I propose a neighborhood beautification initiative this Saturday. Volunteers will assist in removing the offending vegetation and replacing it with HOA-approved landscaping." "All in favor?" Several hands went up, but far fewer than Karen had clearly expected. "You want us to go onto someone's property and remove their plants without permission?" asked an older man in a golf shirt. "That sounds an awful lot like trespassing and destruction of property." Karen's smile tightened. "Walter, it's a community service project. We'll leave his yard looking better than we found it." With all due respect, Walter persisted, "How is that different from breaking into someone's house and rearranging their furniture because you don't like their decorating style?" A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, and Karen's cheeks flushed. "This is about maintaining standards, not personal preference." "Then why are we only targeting this one house?" called a voice from the back. "The Hendersons painted their shed that awful yellow color last month, and you didn't call an emergency meeting about that." Karen gripped the podium, her knuckles whitening. "The Hendersons filed the proper color change request forms. After you issue them 3 violation notices," someone muttered loudly enough to be heard. The meeting was slipping out of Karen's control. She tapped her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order as multiple conversations broke out across the room. "Perhaps," suggested Diane, rising from her seat in the front row, "we should reconsider whether this is an appropriate use of HOA resources. The legal fees alone could impact our budget for the community pool renovation." At the mention of the pool, a popular project among residents, heads nodded in agreement. Karen sensed the tide turning against her. In a desperate bid to regain control, she unveiled her final slide. A chart purporting to show declining property values in neighborhoods without strict landscaping enforcement. "Property values in communities with lax standards have decreased by up to 15%, she declared, pointing to a graph with an ominously plunging red line. "Where did this data come from?" asked a woman who happened to be a professional statistician. Karen hesitated. Various industry sources. Which one specifically? Karen's composure finally cracked. Does it matter? Look at the trend line. This is what happens when we allow individual expression to override community standards. The phrase individual expression emerged from her mouth as if it were a profanity. In Michael's living room, Officer Jenkins chuckled. She's losing them. Time for our surprise, Michael said, reaching for his phone. On the screen, they watched as Karen desperately tried to steer the meeting back to her agenda when a collective chime rang out across the room. Dozens of phones simultaneously received a text message. Confusion spread as attendees checked their phones. Karen, sensing another disruption, rapped her gavel furiously. Attention, please. Whatever is can wait until after our vote. But it was too late. People were showing their screens to neighbors, murmuring and most alarmingly for Karen laughing. Michael had sent a mass text to the entire HOA contact list, obtained through Eleanor's connections, containing a single image, security camera footage of Karen attempting to measure his roses with a ruler at 5:30 that morning, wearing a trench coat and what appeared to be a false mustache as a disguise. The caption read simply, "Is this really what you want your HO-induced funding?" Karen's world collapsed in slow motion. As laughter rippled through the community center, her carefully constructed facade of authority crumbled. The image on everyone's phones, Karen in her ridiculous disguise, measuring roses with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb, transformed her crusade from righteous to ridiculous in an instant. This is an invasion of privacy," she spluttered, but her protests were drowned out by the growing amusement of her neighbors. "Is that a fake mustache?" someone called out, triggering another wave of laughter. Karen's committee members, sensing the shifting winds, began edging away from the podium. Roger suddenly remembered an urgent appointment. Diane became intensely interested in her phone. Even Walter, who had mostly joined for the refreshments, abandoned his half-eaten cookie and slipped toward the exit. "This meeting is not adjourned," Karen declared, banging her gavel with increasing desperation. "We have not voted on the community intervention." But it was too late. The formal meeting had dissolved into small clusters of neighbors showing each other the photo and sharing stories of their own encounters with Karen's zealous rule enforcement. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Karen played her final card. This is exactly the kind of behavior we should expect from someone who refuses to comply with reasonable standards. He's making a mockery of our community values. Her words fell on deaf ears. The tide had turned, and Karen found herself stranded on the wrong shore. As the room emptied, Karen remained at the podium, straightening her already immaculate papers with trembling hands. Only Ethan and his camera remained, capturing her isolation in painful detail. "You can stop recording now," she snapped. Ethan lowered his camera. "Actually, Mrs. Westfield, I think you might want to see something." He approached, offering his tablet. On the screen was a live stream of Michael's living room, where Michael, Eleanor, and Officer Jenkins sat watching the now empty community center. When Ethan turned the camera toward Karen, she found herself face to face with her adversary. "Good evening, Mrs. Westfield," Michael said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind that I attended your meeting virtually." Karen's expression shifted from shock to outrage. You had no right." Actually, Eleanor chimed in, "As a public meeting of a registered neighborhood association, anyone can observe. State law." Karen struggled to formulate a response, her usual arsenal of rules and regulations failing her. Michael leaned closer to the camera. "Mrs. Westfield, I think it's time we talk directly, without disguises or legal threats. Would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow? Just the two of us." The unexpectedness of the invitation momentarily silenced Karen. She had prepared for resistance, for legal battles, even for community conflict, but not for a simple conversation. "Why would I do that?" She finally managed, her voice lacking its usual authority. "Because," Michael replied calmly, "I think we both want the same thing. A beautiful neighborhood we can be proud of. We just have different ideas about how to achieve that." Karen's instinct was to refuse, to double down on her position. But with her committee disbanded and her credibility damaged, her options were limited. After a long moment, she nodded stiffly. "Fine. Tomorrow at noon. The coffee shop on Main." The screen went dark as Ethan ended the live stream. Karen sank into the nearest chair, suddenly exhausted. The community center, usually so familiar and comforting in its orderliness, felt cavernous and cold. For the first time since becoming HOA president, Karen questioned her approach. The image of herself in that ridiculous disguise haunted her. Was that really how people saw her? Not as a guardian of community standards, but as a neighborhood joke? Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Meeting over?" How did it go? She couldn't bring herself to respond. As she gathered her materials, Karen noticed something on the back wall of the community center that she'd somehow never really seen before, despite attending meetings here for years. a faded photograph from the 1950s showing the original Oak Ridge estates. The homes were smaller then, the yards more diverse. One property featured an elaborate rose garden that sprawled joyfully across its front yard, with neighbors gathered around admiring the blooms. Karen paused, studying the faces in the old photograph. No one in the image seemed concerned about property values or uniform aesthetics. They simply looked happy. Something shifted almost imperceptibly inside her as she switched off the lights and left the building. Tomorrow's meeting with Michael would not be the confrontation she had originally envisioned. What it would be instead, she wasn't entirely sure. For the first time in years, Karen Westfield found herself stepping into uncertainty, and the sensation was both terrifying and strangely liberating.